Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, an update on PFAS health effects and exposure research in Massachusetts. I am Dr. Barbara Malkus, Board President for Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition is dedicated to preventing environmental causes of breast cancer through community education, research advocacy, and changes to public policy. I am pleased to welcome to today's speaker, Dr. Laurel Schaider. Dr. Schaider is a senior scientist at Silent Spring Institute, where she leads the Institute's water quality research on PFAS and other contaminants of emerging concern. She studies PFAS chemicals in drinking water, consumer products, and food, drinking water contamination from septic systems, and environmental justice disparities in drinking water quality. Dr. Schaider, welcome back to MBCC's webinar series.
It's always great to be back, Dr. Malkus. Thanks for having me. And thanks to everyone who's tuning in today. It's great to be a part of this webinar again. Today, I'm going to share some updates on the work that Silent Spring Institute has been conducting on PFAS exposures and health. And I'll also share some other updates on resources, tips for things that you can do, and some updates about what's happening at the federal level as well. My guess is many of you are familiar with Silent Spring Institute, but for those of you who are new, we are an independent nonprofit research organization, and we're dedicated to understanding links between everyday chemical exposures and women's health, with a particular focus on breast cancer prevention. We were actually founded by Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition over 30 years ago. The visionary activists at MBCC recognized the need for more scientific research to understand environmental causes of breast cancer and other disease. They saw this as an important step towards prevention. So over the past 31 years, we have developed into a leading scientific research organization with expertise on environmental causes of breast cancer. And we continue to partner really closely with MBCC and with other advocacy organizations who help to amplify the impact of our research. Our research is pretty far-reaching, but some of our general research questions include: how do we identify chemicals that might play a role in breast cancer? So for that, we look at published studies as well as conducting our own research to understand which chemicals could plausibly play a role in breast cancer. We understand how we're exposed to these chemicals, and this is where a lot of my work has come in. We look at chemicals in drinking water, in food, in consumer products, in indoor air and dust, and in building materials. We try to do what we can to learn more about how these chemical exposures can affect our health. In some cases, this is epidemiological studies in people who've been exposed, laboratory studies, and using new methods to assess chemical toxicity. Ultimately, our goal is to limit exposures to these chemicals. And so that can be steps that individuals can take. This can include informing policymakers and also sharing information with retailers and product manufacturers with the goal of creating safer products and a safer marketplace. And then we also engage actively with impacted communities throughout our research. So I'll talk about some of our research today, but I wanted to also share a couple of examples of our community engagement and research translation. For instance, last December, I was invited to speak to a Senate subcommittee hearing on PFAS. We take part in webinars such as this MBCC webinar series and hold a number of community presentations. We actively work with community partners in phases of our research, and we write editorials and commentaries, both from Silent Spring alone, and then I have an example here from an editorial that I wrote with Cheryl Osimo from MBCC for the Cape Cod Times. So for today's presentation, I'm going to provide an overview of PFAS. My guess is many of you might be already pretty familiar with these chemicals, but if you're new or would like a refresher, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about where these chemicals come from, how we can be exposed, and what we know about health effects. I'll talk about some of our Silent Spring Institute research on exposures and health effects, talk a bit about PFAS in drinking water, both from our own research and also recent federal updates, and then at the end, share some resources you may find helpful and tips for things that you can do. So PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's an acronym representing a class of over 14,000 different chemicals. These have been called forever chemicals because in the environment and in our bodies, these chemical structures don't break down. The PFAS are mobile in the environment. They've been found in rainwater, in ocean water, in the blood of indigenous communities in the Arctic. Really, these are global contaminants. You may wonder why there's so much awareness and concern about PFAS now when they've been actually used in products since the 1950s. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is the widespread discovery of PFAS in drinking water, particularly some testing that EPA required from 2010 to 2015. People, I think, were quite surprised to see how prevalent PFAS are in our drinking water supplies. There's also been a considerable advocacy from communities, particularly in areas of drinking water or environmental contamination. And it's through the work of community activists that I think a lot of action and progress has been made on this topic. If you'd like to learn more about PFAS, I recommend the films Dark Waters and The Devil We Know, focused on a community in West Virginia near a DuPont plant, and the heroic work of a lawyer, Rob Bellot, to fight for justice for the community. And just this year, there were also 2 books that were published, They Poison the World and Poisoning the Well. The authors of these books were at bookshops doing presentations earlier this year. I've read They Poison the World and excited to read Poisoning the Well as well. I'm not going to do a deep dive on chemistry today, but I wanted to introduce you to some examples of the family of PFAS chemicals. So many of the PFAS that we worry about in terms of their ability to be found in drinking water or to accumulate in our blood are what we call non-polymers. So these are kind of smallish molecules that move around in the environment. Some of these are what we call long chain PFAS. So that means they have a long carbon chain at their core. The hallmark of a PFAS chemical is having many carbon-fluorine bonds. These are the strongest bonds in organic chemistry, and they make these chemicals really difficult to break down. Industry has phased out the use of many of these long-chain PFAS here in the US. In their place, they're using other PFAS. Some of them are short-chain PFAS, like PFHXA over here, and some of them are different in their chemistry. So this one has an oxygen in the middle of the carbon chain. And I just wanted to point out that this is PFOS and this is PFOA. And these will come up later when we're talking about PFAS levels in blood. And then other PFAS are what we call polymers. So big long chain. This is what Teflon looks like, and it's actually much larger than what I'm showing here. So it's these large molecules that are in products that are made by putting together these smaller building blocks. Even if you haven't heard much of PFAS before, PFAS are a part of your life. They're widely used in nonstick, stain-resistant, waterproof, and grease-proof products. Many people are surprised to learn that Oral-B Glide dental floss is made out of Teflon. PFAS are widely used in cosmetics, certain types of waxes, paints, building materials, even things like guitar strings and rock climbing ropes. They're in cell phones and electronics. They're really integrated into our daily lives. And for those of us who are trying to reduce our exposures, that can be tricky because they often are not labeled on products. Silent Spring Institute was actually the first to find PFAS in drinking water on Cape Cod in 2009 to 2011. And so my earliest work was to focus on drinking water quality and to understand how septic systems and other sources could be the reason why PFAS were entering into public and private wells. But our work has been pretty far-reaching. We led a study on PFAS in fast food packaging, which has prompted states to take action to ban PFAS in food packaging. And now the FDA has taken action to restrict PFAS in paper-based food packaging. We've done studies that have shown that people who eat more fast food, who use Oral-B Glide dental floss, or have stain-resistant textiles in their homes tend to have higher levels in their blood. And we've also documented the widespread presence of PFAS in consumer products marketed for children and adolescents, particularly those marketed as stain-resistant or waterproof. Because of the widespread use of PFAS in consumer products and their resistance to degradation, exposures to PFAS are widespread. They're also difficult for our bodies to excrete. So the CDC estimates that over 99% of people in the US have PFAS in our blood. Some PFAS, so the long chain PFAS that I showed a few slides ago, tend to stay in our bodies for long amounts of time, and this is because these are difficult for our bodies to excrete. So long-chain PFAS can stay in our bodies for years. Those newer current use PFAS still can stay in our bodies for extended amounts of time, more on the order of weeks to months. And for many PFAS, we actually don't know how long is their what's called the half-life, so how long these chemicals end up staying in our blood. You may wonder who tends to have the highest levels of PFAS in their blood. Certainly people who are occupationally exposed can have particularly high levels. These include people who work at fluoropolymer manufacturing facilities. There's also some evidence that firefighters can have elevated exposures from the use of PFAS in a certain class of firefighting foam used for flammable fuel fires, and also from the turnout gear that firefighters use for protection. In general, older adults have higher levels than younger adults, and this is because PFAS can accumulate over our lifetime. And in general, men have higher levels of PFAS in their blood than women. And this is attributable to the fact that PFAS bind really tightly to proteins in our blood. So women can lose PFAS from their bodies from menstruation. Unfortunately, we also pass along PFAS to the next generation through pregnancy and breastfeeding. So babies are born with PFAS already in their blood. This also means that women's levels are lower because some of the PFAS from their bodies gets transferred. I think an important thing to know is that when we reduce exposures to PFAS, that the levels of PFAS in people's blood does go down. I know sometimes people hear the term forever chemicals and they think that we're going to have these chemicals in our bodies forever. And while the long-chain PFAS do stay in our bodies for long amounts of time, it's not forever. What I'm showing here are the results of testing from CDC. They test for things like PFAS in people's blood. They do a sampling of several thousand adults and children every couple of years as a representative sampling for the general population. And what you can see here, particularly for PFOS, is that the levels have gone down considerably. Postdoctoral fellow Abby Blind. We recruited children who were potentially exposed to PFAS at the Pease Trade Port in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, as part of our PFAS REACH study. And we conducted this testing in 2023 to 2024. So this is the light blue bars here. And we compared our results to earlier testing from 2015, conducted by the state of New Hampshire, and from 2019 to 2021, conducted by CDC and ATSDR, which is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And we do see that the levels in children have gone down. So again, I think this is an important message that when we reduce exposures, that this does lead to lower levels in people's blood over time. But one thing that I do worry about, so we see these declines in exposures and blood levels for long-chain PFAS. Increasingly, new products have different types of PFAS, the short chain, perfluoroether, and other alternative PFAS. And so it's likely that exposures to these newer PFAS are increasing. These PFAS don't tend to show up in blood in the same way, so we don't have as much information about the extent of exposures, but it's likely that exposures to newer PFAS are increasing. And sometimes people ask me, what is our largest source of exposure to PFAS? And the answer is really that it depends. So if you're in an area where the water is contaminated, then your largest source of exposure, so you can think of it as pieces of a pie, your largest source of exposure is likely to be that drinking water, at least for the chemicals that are found at high levels in your water. Food and food packaging also can be sources of exposure. The levels of PFAS and things like fish are likely to respond sort of slowly to changes in manufacturing because PFAS are circulating throughout the environment. In the shorter term, when products are reformulated, our exposures to newer PFAS can increase. And so for new PFAS that are used in products now, it's likely that consumer products are probably the largest source of exposure. So this can change. I would just say that the size of the pie can change, and the relative sizes of the pieces of the pie change over time and change depending on which PFAS we're specifically considering. And all of this put together is hugely concerning because numerous exposures, both in people and in laboratory studies of animals, have shown that PFAS exposures are associated with many different types of health effects. I think this is a helpful graphic put together by the European Environment Agency. The health effects shown here with the darker lines are the ones where there's more consistent evidence. So for instance, thyroid disease, testicular and kidney cancer, liver damage, immune toxicity manifested through reduced response to vaccines, and others. And for this audience, for MBCC, I did want to note that there's consistent evidence from animal studies of delayed mammary gland development and some evidence for increased breast cancer risk as well. Other studies have also shown PFAS exposures being linked to shorter duration of lactation and breastfeeding in exposed communities. So all of this raises concerns about the potential for PFAS exposures to play a role in increasing breast cancer risk. That's my overall PFAS 101. So from what I've said so far, we know that PFAS can affect our health in many different ways, but there's still a lot to learn about how PFAS can affect our health, which specific PFAS cause which types of health effects, and how do mixtures of different PFAS affect our health. So to answer those types of questions, I wanted to tell you first about the ATSDR multi-site study. If you've joined a previous webinar, you've probably heard me talk about the study before. This is a study that's being conducted in communities in 8 different states across the US. It's funded and coordinated by the CDC and by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. A lot of communities impacted by PFAS are kind of small. And so in order to do what we call an epidemiological study, so a study of people exposed to chemicals or some other harmful thing in our environment, it's helpful to have a community, a large community of people to give us statistical power to make relationships between people who've had, or evaluate relationships between people who've had low or high levels of exposure and the prevalence of certain diseases. So the broad goal for this is to create a larger study with thousands of people from communities in areas that with a history of water contamination in order to better understand how PFAS can affect our health. And so Silent Spring Institute is leading one of these 8 projects within the multi-site study right here in Massachusetts. Our 2 communities are the towns of Ayr and the village of Hyannis in Barnstable on Cape Cod. We're leading this work together with other researchers from the Harvard School of Public Health and Eastern Research Group. For our work in Hyannis, we were proud to partner with Cheryl Osimo and other MBCC partners. And in Ayr, we worked with the people of Ayr concerned about the environment. And I've talked about this study before, so if you'd like more details, I would recommend going into the MBCC archive to learn from some information from the previous webinars. For today, I'll provide some brief study information and share some more recent updates. So overall, our study recruited 689 adults and 90 children, ages 4 to 17, to be part of our study. It took a lot of work. It really did take a village to recruit and enroll participants of all ages to be in our study. For participants who did sign up to be in the study, they came to our local study clinics. They provided blood and urine samples. They provided body measurements like height, weight, and blood pressure. They filled out questionnaires about their health, about their water consumption, and where they'd lived and worked over time. And for kids ages 5 to 17, we also conducted neurobehavioral testing. So the participants have received their own results of their PFAS and their clinical lab tests. And we also held a series of community updates in June of 2024 to share community level findings with residents in Hyannis and Ayr. Now that all the sites have wrapped up data collection, we all finished it at the end of 2023. I'm going to share some information now about the cohort of sites overall. So what I'm showing here are the number of adults and children from all the sites combined. Here's our row here in Massachusetts. And you can see that nearly 6,000 adults and a little over 700 children are part of this broader multi-site study overall. So earlier this year, a new peer-reviewed paper was published that described the methods for the multi-site study and shared detailed information about the blood test results across our 8 sites. So I put the link to that here in a QR code for those of you who really want to dive into the details. If you want kind of the Cliff Notes version of it, Silent Spring also worked with ATSDR and the other sites to develop a 2-page overview with key findings from the work so far. So some key findings from the blood test results. So 4 of the long chain PFAS, PFOA, PFHXS, and PFNA were found in nearly all of the adults who took part in the study. And then 3 additional long chain PFAS, so PFDA, PFUNDA, and MIFOSA, were found in between 30 and 55% of the adult participants. So still pretty common, but not in nearly all of the participants. We also saw that the levels of PFAS varied across the sites, and this made sense to us. Some of the sites were impacted by firefighting foams called AFFF, and in those communities, we tend to see PFAS and PFHXS are more elevated. In areas impacted by Teflon manufacturing, PFOA tends to be the predominant PFAS. And in one community in New Jersey, PFNA was higher than other communities because of a local manufacturing facility. So these differences in relative amounts and the extent of levels in people's blood reflect what was in the water over time. So to visualize that a little bit, what I'm showing here are the average, calculated as the geometric mean, blood levels across the 8 sites shown in the blue bars. The green shows the average for all the sites combined, and then the gold shows the general US population, and that's from the CDC testing that I showed earlier. I did want to note that the general US, the samples for the general US population were collected in 2017 to 2020, whereas for most of our sites, the data were collected from our participants in 2021 to 2023. If you'll recall that graph showing the blood levels in the general US population going down over time, I would say that it's likely that these gold bars would have been lower if they reflected samples collected at the same time that our study took place. I just wanted to mention that in case you were wondering why there might be sites that are actually lower than the general US population. I think that reflects the differences in the time when the samples were collected. But I did want to note a couple of things here. So one is to show that for our Massachusetts participants, and this is averaged between Hyannis and Air combined, that our levels were kind of in the middle compared to the other sites. So some other sites were higher in certain PFAS than Massachusetts, and some were lower. I did also want to note, for instance, that in New York, which included the Hoosick Falls site, which was a Teflon manufacturing site, that likely explains why they had the highest levels of PFOA. By contrast, Colorado was a site impacted by firefighting foams, same with Pennsylvania, and so that's likely why those sites had the highest levels of PFHXS. Overall, the average PFHXS level among participants in our study was about twice as high as the general US population, and the average PFOA level was about 12% higher than the general population. Some other key findings, so looking beyond just adults, we did find that children had lower levels of PFAS than adults, which is expected and consistent with other studies. We also saw that compared to children in the general US population, that children in the multi-site study had higher levels of PFHXS. That's consistent with what we saw with the adults. We also saw that for premenopausal females, in general, they had lower levels of PFAS than males, and that's, again, expected, related to PFAS losses from the body, from menstruation, and from pregnancy and breastfeeding. By contrast, for older adults, so females that were postmenopausal, the levels between men and women were more similar. Another component of the multi-site study, which I think is pretty cool and will help us learn more about PFAS health effects, is what we're calling the reconstruction of historical exposures. When we look at someone's blood level at the time they took part in the study, the level of PFAS in their blood reflects their exposures really over the past maybe several years, maybe decade or two for the PFAS that accumulate in our bodies for the longest. But it doesn't necessarily tell us about who had the highest levels of exposure over time. It doesn't necessarily help us distinguish someone who drank unfiltered tap water and lived in the study area their whole lives versus someone who might have moved to the study area more recently. And because both of our communities, or all of the communities in the multi-site study had put in place filtration or taken other steps to mitigate the PFAS, the levels that we're measuring in blood in 2021 to 2023 might not really reflect the exposures that happened earlier on. So to get a better sense of chronic and long-term exposures over time, each of our sites are reconstructing the levels of PFAS in drinking water for their communities over time. So this involves developing groundwater models or surface water models to understand how PFAS move through the local environment, to estimate how much PFAS was reaching each participant's home during the time of the study, and then estimating how much PFAS they might have been exposed to. So taking into account, this is someone who drank bottled water or filtered water and other water-related behaviors. And all of this put together will allow us to use what's called a pharmacokinetic model. So the model allows us to input ingestion of PFAS from water, and the model will predict a corresponding PFAS blood level. So our goal is to go back in time to the year 2000 and to estimate the levels of PFAS, PFOA, PFNA, and PFH excess in the blood of all of our participants. And this will be a really powerful tool for us to extend our epidemiological analyses, not just to look at blood levels in 2021 to 2023, but to think about exposures over a much longer period of time. Now that the sites have finished with, or now that the studies have been published on the levels of PFAS in people's blood, I also wanted to share with you some updates about the analyses focused on health effects. This slide is taken from a webinar that ATSDR hosted in July that provides an update on the health effects analyses that are also underway. So right now there are 7 key health outcomes that are being assessed across the multi-site teams. So using data from all the 8 sites, researchers within the multi-site study are looking at how PFAS exposures may affect lipids levels, thyroid function, diabetes, blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, and obesity. There are also other analyses underway, but this was kind of the initial set of health outcomes that sites selected to look at more carefully. I wanted to focus on one of these specifically, so blood pressure. And this is work that's being led by a postdoctoral research fellow here at Silent Spring, Dr. Yuting Wang. Her previous work had also looked at PFAS exposures and risk of hypertension, which is high blood pressure. Some prior studies have found that PFAS exposures are associated with increased blood pressure and hypertension risk, but this has not been consistently observed from previous studies. So in Yuting's analyses, she's looking at data from participants across the multi-site study and focusing on people who are not taking medications to lower their hypertension. And the key questions that we're looking at are whether higher levels of PFAS in blood are associated with higher blood pressure, whether there are certain PFAS that have a stronger effect on blood pressure, and whether these effects vary by age or by other factors. And this is part of a much longer paper that Yuting is working on, but I wanted to share a few key findings. So far, our results have found that higher levels of PFAS were associated with increased blood pressure. So I'll walk you through this graph. So what we're showing here are results for systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. So these are the 2 numbers when you get your blood pressure measured. What we're showing here, so these are for the 4 most frequently detected PFAS in people's blood. What we're showing is how much, on average, blood pressure changes for each doubling of PFAS in people's blood across the study population. And what this graph is showing here is that pretty consistently that for PFH excess, for PFAS, and for diastolic blood pressure, also for PFOA, that there's an increase in blood pressure for every doubling of PFAS, and for PFNA too here for systolic blood pressure. And it might look like a small change to you. So this is saying that for each doubling of PFAS in blood, the level of your blood pressure goes up by about half of a millimeter of mercury. That's what the number when you get your blood pressure measured means. But these are still really significant because there are people who have quite high levels of PFAS in their blood, so maybe many doublings. And it is really concerning that people's exposure to PFAS are changing their blood pressure in these significant ways. And we know small changes do add up and do matter. And I'll note that these analyses take into account factors such as age, sex, and race and ethnicity. We also saw that higher levels of PFAS in people's blood were associated with greater risk of hypertension prevalence. So for each of our participants, we looked at their blood pressure results to classify whether or not they'd be considered as having hypertension. And what this is showing here is the prevalence of hypertension. So this is when it says 1.05, that means that there's a 5% higher prevalence. And so what we're seeing here, again, is for every doubling of PFAS, that the likelihood of someone having high blood pressure increases by about 5%. Again, it might seem like a small change, but it does really add up, especially for people with the highest levels of exposure. And then one additional key finding that I wanted to share with you is that we tended to see that the associations between blood pressure and increased PFAS and blood pressure were greatest among younger participants, which might have seemed a bit surprising because in general, we worry more about blood pressure in older parts of the population. But what we're seeing here is that in these younger age groups, that the associations are higher and more significant than for people who are older. And so what this may suggest is that PFAS has a more significant effect on younger people compared to older people. So in addition to analyzing results from all of the sites combined, we also have done some additional analyses looking at our results specifically for participants in Hyannis and Air, where we collected additional information about their residential history and took a closer look at things that might predict levels of PFAS in people's blood in our two communities. A couple of things to keep in mind. Both Hyannis and Air are currently treating their water to filter out PFAS. But in the past, Hyannis drinking water used to have higher levels of PFAS than Air, and actually higher than any other community in Massachusetts. For both communities, it's been about 4 to 7 years between the major mitigation of PFAS in the drinking water and when participants came into our study offices to have their blood tested. So given this time lag between when the levels of PFAS in water used to be high and when we collected blood samples, we had some guiding research questions. So we wanted to know whether the levels of PFAS in people's blood was related to the amount of time that they lived in the study area. And particularly, we're focusing on the time prior to when the major mitigation efforts were taking place in both communities. And then we also wondered whether PFAS blood levels now still reflected anything about whether people drank bottled water or whether they had home water filtration. And this work is being led by one of our staff scientists here at Silent Spring, Emily Heckel. So what we found is that in both communities, that the amount of time that participants lived in the study area was significantly associated with higher levels of PFAS in their blood. And I won't get into all of the details of these analyses, but I will note that these analyses take into account other factors, specifically the age of our participants. So just to walk you through these graphs, what we're showing here is the percent change in people's blood levels compared to participants who lived in the study area for less than 5 years. So just to walk you through a specific example here. So for people in Hyannis, looking at PFHXS, we see that people who lived in the study area for longer amounts of time, so this is 5 to 10 years, 10 to 16 years, and more than 16 years, tended to have higher levels of PFAS in their blood. For people who lived in Hyannis the longest, they had more than twice the levels compared to people who lived in the study area for less than 5 years. And again, I'll note that we are focusing on the period of time between the year 2000, which is when our residential history assessment began, and either 2016 or 2018. Those are the years when Hyannis and Air took major steps to reduce the levels of PFAS in the drinking water. And so we see quite a significant increase in Hyannis, again, where the water used to have much higher levels of PFAS than in air. But even in air, where the levels of PFAS in the drinking water were lower, we do still see that compared to people who lived in the study area for a shorter amount of time, that the levels of people's blood were higher for the longer term residents. We also asked participants questions about whether they filtered their water at home, and we asked if they mostly drank bottled water or tap water. So what I'm showing in this graph really helps us answer the question of how water filtration and bottled water consumption may be reflected in people's blood levels. So in short, we saw that home water filtration and bottled water consumption were strong predictors of PFAS blood levels, particularly in Hyannis. So what I'm showing here, the reference group, or kind of the baseline, are people who drank unfiltered tap water. The blue dots are showing people who said that they had home water filtration. And for this analysis, we didn't attempt to categorize the type of filter into whether it's a filter that did or did not remove PFAS. Just one simple question, whether they used home water filtration. And then the purple is showing people who reported primarily drinking bottled water. So what we're seeing here is that for participants in Hyannis, those who used home water filters or drank mostly bottled water on average had 18 to 40% lower levels of PFAS in their blood than those who drank unfiltered tap water. This is years after municipal water treatment was put in place. By contrast, in air, we tended not to really see much of a change for people who had bottled water or filtered their water at home compared to those who drank unfiltered tap water. And this is likely explained by the fact that the air drinking water used to have lower levels of PFAS compared to Hyannis. Now, my take-home message is not that everyone should rush out and get bottled water. And by contrast, it actually points to the importance of treating PFAS in municipal water supplies as early as possible, so that at the population level, we're reducing cumulative exposures over long periods of time. So in terms of what's next for the multi-site study, so again, ATSDR held a webinar in July, and you can find information on the ATSDR website if you'd like to look at the slides or the video from that. You can hear initial updates on these other health outcomes as well. It takes a while to analyze the data, to write a paper, and we're coordinating with co-authors from ATSDR and from all of the other sites. So we anticipate that the earliest papers on health effects, hopefully UTINGS will be among them, will be published next spring or so, after they go through CDC clearance and through journal article review. And then the teams are still working on the reconstruction of the past water and blood levels going back to 2000. And once that work is done, that will be incorporated into future analyses to better understand chronic and long-term effects from PFAS exposures. Beyond drinking water, we also receive questions from participants in our communities about other ways they may be exposed to PFAS. As part of the STEEP project, STEEP is the Sources, Transport, Exposures, and Effects of PFAS Superfund Research Program led by the University of Rhode Island, we have the opportunity to address some of these questions. So one thing we want to know is that in areas like Hyannis, the tap water used to have high levels of PFAS, but it's now being treated. But we wonder whether yard soils might have retained some of those high levels of PFAS from the past. And people have asked us questions about whether there's any concerns about homegrown produce. So right now, I went out in the field in Hyannis with our one of our research associates here, Catherine Franz. We collected yard soil and homegrown produce samples from 30 homes in and around Hyannis. We don't have those results yet, but we'll be able to answer questions about whether PFAS levels are elevated in yard soils in Hyannis related to the past water contamination, and whether there's any accumulation of PFAS in homegrown produce. So switching gears now to talk more generally about PFAS in drinking water. PFAS are a concern all over the Commonwealth as well as all over the country. A number of water systems have detected and are addressing PFAS in their public water supplies. There's growing awareness of the waste stream as being an important source of contamination. For instance, there's a community in Westminster where a composting facility was actually the source of water, private well water contamination. So in different communities, these types of challenges can look different, but it's important to know that there are a lot of communities that are working to address PFAS. I've mentioned some of these already, but PFAS can get into water from the use of AFFF firefighting foam. So high levels tend to be found in groundwater near airports, military bases, and other fire training areas. Certainly industrial areas where fluoropolymers are manufactured or Teflon coated products are produced can lead to high levels of environmental contamination and high exposures among local communities. And then lower but more common levels of contamination are often traced to wastewater treatment plants, septic systems, leachate from landfills, and land applied sludge. So if you're paying attention to PFAS, you likely have heard that the EPA did put in place drinking water standards. This was a huge victory, in my opinion, for public health last year. When I started working on PFAS in 2009, the EPA had non-enforceable guidelines of 400 and 200 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFAS in drinking water. Fast forward to 2024, and EPA put in place standards of 4, so almost 2 orders of magnitude lower, 4 parts per trillion for PFAS and PFOA. And notably, these were enforceable drinking water standards. So every water supply across the country was going to have to come into compliance with these standards. They also added on standards for 4 additional PFAS, so restricting these 3 at 10 parts per trillion, and they also developed a combined hazard index for those 3 plus a 4th PFAS. And water systems were going to have 5 years to come into compliance for testing and meeting the standard. Unfortunately, things have changed, and the standards are now in the process of being rolled back or delayed. So EPA is no longer planning to follow up on putting in place the standards for the 4 additional PFAS. They are keeping in place the 4 parts per trillion standard for PFAS and PFOA. And that won't protect every community, but it will go a long way towards addressing PFAS contamination in a lot of areas. Water systems also will now have 2 additional years, so out to 2031 to come into compliance with the standards. And I'm certainly sympathetic to the challenges water systems face, particularly the cost in meeting these standards. But I worry about delaying their implementation even further because that will mean longer exposures in communities. Some states, prior to the EPA standards, took their own action on PFAS by putting in place unenforceable guidelines or enforceable standards prior to 2024. Massachusetts is one of those states, and we have had a standard for these 6 PFAS, called PFAS 6, of 20 parts per trillion since October of 2020. If you want to know more about your own water system, for those of you here in Massachusetts, the Mass Department of Environmental Protection has this website. It's interactive GIS interface. I think there are about 11 or 12% of water systems across the Commonwealth that have had an exceedance of that PFAS 6 standard. In some cases, it's a water system serving a whole town. In other cases, it's a water system serving a school building or a business or some smaller area. So if you go to the website, you can zoom in, and if you, for instance, clicked on Barnstable, you could see information about the Hyannis water system. So it's a helpful way to learn more about PFAS in your water supply. Some other options, particularly for those of you outside of Massachusetts, a great place to start is to call your water department or to look for the most recent water quality report. For those of you who like to get really into the data, there is a state DEP data portal where you can download spreadsheets and look at the levels in your water supply. And again, there's that interactive map as well. And then there's a new round of testing that EPA is requiring for public water supplies to test for 29 different PFAS. And EPA has this website, checked this morning, it's still working, where you can learn more information about PFAS testing in your water system. For private wells, testing is generally not mandatory. You could check with your town's health department to see if there's been any evidence of PFAS in private wells near where you live. If you want to find out about PFAS in your private well, you're likely on your own to get your water tested. I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about environmental justice and drinking water, particularly as we think of about the rollback of federal drinking water standards. Certainly after the Flint water crisis and high levels of lead in the Flint drinking water supply, there's been increasing awareness on environmental justice and the uneven distribution and the inequitable distribution of poor water quality. So beyond lead, nitrate and other water contaminants also have been found to be more common in communities of color. Much of the prior work has focused on regulated drinking water contaminants, but we also wanted to look at whether there were differences in the levels of unregulated contaminants in US public water supplies based on race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status, and whether if we do see disparities, is that just related to proximity to pollution sources, or are there other factors at play? So I wanted to share some key findings from a paper published earlier this year in Environmental Health Perspectives. The lead author was one of our staff scientists, Erin Maruzzo. The paper analyzed data from an EPA data set of data from 2013 to 2015. For those of you who study PFAS or think about PFAS a lot, this is the UCMR3 data. We also compiled information about public water system characteristics and the demographics of populations served by each water supply. While our focus has often been on PFAS, we also looked at 1,4-dioxane, 1,1-dichloroethane, and HCFC-22. So 3 other industrial contaminants that are not yet regulated in drinking water, but are of concern. So if you want to dive into the paper, here's a QR code to learn more. A couple key findings from the paper. So across those 4 different types of contaminants, we did see that nearly 1/3 of the country, so 97 million US residents, were served by a public water supply where at least one of those contaminants were detected. I will note that the data for PFAS, so these all come from 2013 to 2015. At that time, the tests for PFAS were not very sensitive. So we now know that PFAS show up in more like half of the US water supplies, but at that time we had a less sensitive screening method. So we were really only seeing the tip of the iceberg with respect to PFAS. We did see that water systems that had detections of these contaminants tended to have higher proportions of Hispanic and Black residents. So for instance, in this bar graph here, what we're seeing is water systems that did have contaminant detections had a higher percent of Hispanic residents compared to water systems that did not have detections of any of these contaminants. Similarly, water systems that exceeded an EPA health reference level also had higher proportions of Hispanic residents. We also saw that these contaminants were more common in water systems in urban areas and in those served by groundwater. And I will not get into the details of these analyses, but I will emphasize that the percent Hispanic was associated with detections of these contaminants even after we accounted for other factors such as income and urbanicity, system size, and the proximity to pollution sources. So just to show one example here, we did see that percent Hispanic was significantly associated with the odds of detecting at least one of the contaminants in our study, even after we accounted for all of these other factors. And our paper did receive quite a bit of media coverage, including this coverage from Newsweek. So to wrap us up here, I see we're getting close to the end of the hour. I wanted to conclude with some resources if you'd like to learn more about PFAS. And I know it can be kind of heavy to learn that PFAS are these chemicals that are toxic and in our daily environment and in all of our bodies, but there are some things that we can do. A resource that I would recommend is our PFAS Exchange website, which has fact sheets with common responses to questions that community members commonly have. We have a data interpretation tool to help understand results of water and blood testing, and a connecting communities map developed by our colleagues at Northeastern University with information on known and likely contamination sites. We're currently in the process of upgrading the site, so stay tuned. Sometime in next January, we plan to launch an updated version of the Exchange. The Exchange has information about blood testing resources, so how people can get access to PFAS blood tests and some things to keep in mind if you're looking for that type of information. Some information about specific labs that offer this testing. We've got a whole set of resources for clinicians. I'll give a special note to the Continuing Medical Education, or CME course, which clinicians can take for credit through Michigan State University. We also have medical screening guidance documents that provide suggestions for types of screenings that clinicians may want to consider for people who've had elevated exposures. This is a screenshot of our What's My Exposure tool. So if you have results from water or blood testing, you can type the results into our interface here, and the tool will help you interpret those results in real time, comparing to standards in the case of water, or compared to the general population in the case of blood. Separately, we have a tool for other contaminants, privatewells.silentspring.org, which provides similar information for nitrate or lead or other regulated contaminants in drinking water. We also have additional resources for private well owners on the STEEP website. Here's an example of tips for well owners, as well as the results of PFAS water testing that we've conducted for well owners on the Cape. Speaking of STEEP, we also have a webinar series underway focused on connecting communities with science. So the vision for these webinars is to connect STEEP researchers with Cape leaders on PFAS. We just had our 4th webinar yesterday, and I wanted to have a special shout out to Cheryl, who joined me in our 3rd webinar, which focused on PFAS and Cape drinking water. Our other webinars so far have focused on PFAS exposures from consumer products, PFAS accumulation in fish, and yesterday's webinar focused on tribal perspectives. And our next webinar on November 12th will focus on PFAS health effects. I hope all of you have heard or will consider downloading the Detox Me smartphone app, which provides tips for reducing exposures to PFAS and other toxic chemicals. If you'd like to get more involved, there's legislation that's currently being considered here in Massachusetts. Some great resources are the MBCC website, as well as Clean Water Action. And to know more about state level policies and regulations across the country, I'd recommend checking out the Safer States website. So some other ways you can get involved: we can all vote with our dollars, so letting retailers know that you want products that don't contain PFAS or other harmful products. Vote for candidates who support stricter chemical safety testing. Share what you've learned. So for those of you who are learning new things from the webinar today, I hope you'll share some of this information with friends or family. Individually, we have sort of a small vote with our money, but if you're at all involved with procurement policies for your town or for your school or workplace, collectively making policies to say, hey, as a workplace or as a town, we will stop buying products with PFAS, can really provide more impact than individually. And there are 3 towns in Massachusetts that have town or city level procurement policies to try to avoid PFAS containing products. You can find out about local organizations and state legislation, as I mentioned. And PFAS can also affect water quality and local ecosystems. So I would urge you to learn about local efforts to protect water quality in your community. Here are some links to the websites that I referred to earlier. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, acknowledge Rachel Carson and her incredible contribution all those years ago, her visionary book, Silent Spring, which we're named in honor of, and my kids, who remind me every day the real reason why I do this work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schaider. I want to invite our audience members who are listening in today that if they have any questions, they can go to the GoToWebinar control panel and scroll down to where it says questions. If they open up that window, there's an opportunity there for them to submit some questions for you to answer. At one point during your presentation, we lost sound for just a very short, brief moment.
Oh.
But it was right when you were talking about the decrease in the long chain PFAS chemicals overall in blood. And I believe that what you were talking about was it really is dependent on what they're actually testing the blood for. And so I think that you were trying at that point to articulate, and I may be off base, you may have said it, but I just want to make sure
Just talking to myself.
it's really dependent on what on the testing that's being done, the data that we're seeing with this overall decrease in PFAS in blood. Is that accurate?
So that the decline, I know that the slide that you're talking about, so the decline in PFAS blood levels in the general population, I don't know if you're seeing my screen still, and that is really related to the phase out of the use of certain PFAS in products. And so what we're seeing here, just to back up, so starting at around the year 2000, manufacturers stopped producing products in the US that contain PFAS and PFOA. And so this decline represents the change in manufacturing over time.
But there may be other chemicals within the category of PFAS that could be increasing, but,
That's right.
But it's with respect to these four.
That's right. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, so for these in particular, the levels are going down. We know these have been phased out of production in the US, but if we had similar data for other PFAS, we might see an increase. The current use PFAS in products tend not to accumulate in our blood to the same degree, but that doesn't mean we're not being exposed. And so it's only part of the picture when we look at these long chain PFAS. So thanks for coming back to that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schaider. And we've had two questions. I'm going to combine them in the interest of time. One is, what are the sources of PFAS in the water supply? And then, does treated sewage and sludge from wastewater treatment plants include PFAS? And what is there a level of exposure to humans and wildlife associated with our treatment of water? So what are the sources of PFAS in our water supply, and what is our level of exposure due to the sludge from wastewater treatment occurs?
Sure, those are great questions. So in terms of what the source of exposure is to drinking water, it depends a little bit where you live. For Hyannis and air, the largest source of water contamination was the use of firefighting foams. In other areas, it could be an industrial source. So it depends a little bit on where you live. And again, that can maybe change over time as well. We do know that, in some places there's contamination from sources that aren't even there anymore, but because the chemicals are so persistent, there can still be long-lasting effects in terms of water contamination. I want to thank you for mentioning the issue of sludge, which is a huge and really unwieldy concern right now. At the forefront of the concerns are farmers in places like Maine, where sludge with high levels of PFAS was added to soils. There have been farmers and dairy farmers who've lost their livelihoods because of contamination. In the case of dairy farmers, the milk having high levels of PFAS, and for others, the plants accumulating PFAS from the soil. And so there's a number of concerns related to that. So one is for consumers of the agricultural products. There's also concerns for the farmers themselves. I was actually at a State House briefing last week with a farmer from Maine who had very high levels of exposure, he and his wife and children, from the contamination of their own well on their farm, as well as losing their farm and their ability to grow plants in the ground there. For some farmers, they're able to change out the types of crops that they're growing, or try to make sure that people are not being exposed to PFAS from edible crops. And in other cases, the farms kind of close down, I guess. So there can be exposures from the food. There's the potential for exposures for farm workers to PFAS in the soil, where there is that high legacy of PFAS in the soils. And then there's also the potential for groundwater contamination. So one of the farms in the dairy farms in Maine, that contamination was discovered because of groundwater contamination and PFAS actually showing up in drinking water. So the cases in Maine are sort of the tip of the iceberg, because in some cases my understanding is there was sludge from paper mills, which was quite high in PFAS, but it's very common to add sludge to farmland And it's very common for wastewater sludge to have PFAS because we all have PFAS products in our homes, and wastewater picks up traces of that. So sludge contains PFAS because these are such persistent chemicals. And I think we're still at the early stages of grasping how the kind of the magnitude of this issue. Sludge has been tested for things like metals in the past, these longer term contaminants, and we haven't until recently had our focus on PFAS, but it's a huge issue in many parts of the country.
One of our other listeners asked the question about the environmental bond bill. This is more in the realm of advocacy. What is the status of funding regarding PFAS in the environmental bond bill?
You know, I will have to look that up. I don't actually know the answer to that question.
Well, that's amazing. We had a question that actually stumped you, Dr. Schaider, and so I'm thrilled because it means that then we'll get that answer and you can come back and we can have another webinar with you talking about our needs for advocacy. And then I just had a quick question before we close out. How do I sign up for the STEEP webinars?
Okay. Great question. So you can go to the STEEP website. Again, I don't know if you're seeing the screen here, you can look at the slides after the fact. So I think it's web.uri.edu/STEEP/webinar or CAPE webinar. Here's the link here. Or you can just go to the STEEP website and you can register for the next webinar. And we've got all of the previous webinars recorded and accessible as YouTube videos.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schaider. That is all of the questions we really can have today. On behalf of myself, the MBCC board, and Cheryl Osimo, MBCC's executive director, I want to thank you, Dr. Schaider, for this very informative discussion today, as always. And I want to thank all of our many listeners for joining us. For those interested in the recording of this webinar, it will be made available later today on the MBCC website. The recording of this webinar will be located at mbcc.org. And if you would like to further support our mission of preventing environmental causes of breast cancer, please consider making a donation by visiting mbcc.org/donate. I appreciate your consideration. Have a great afternoon. Dr. Schaider, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Malkus. Great to see you as always.